Don't forget to like, comment, share and subscribe, and do consider supporting the channel via PayPal or Patreon. You'll find the links in the video description. Round 4 of the Tata Steel Masters, and this was such an intriguing encounter. Magnus Carlsen, world champion, playing white against Jorden van Foreest. Now, Van Foreest won the Tata Steel Masters last year, so he's a force to be reckoned with. And he was part of Magnus Carlsen's team for the World Championship match, the just held against Nepo. So, you know, an interesting dynamic going on there. So let's see. Carlsen started quite gently with knight f3, and instead of going in for maybe a main line with d4, g3. So a quiet start, and indeed it's a symmetrical position, although Carlsen has shown that he's quite an expert in this kind of position where it starts very gently, of course. And here he doesn't exchange, but just plays b3 and holds the tension. So not a great theoretical struggle. Certainly, you know, I'm sure they weren't on grounds that they perhaps analysed together in the World Championship preparation. This is just a position. You know, instead of trying to hit an ace, Carlsen has basically just passed the ball over the net and says, okay, the rally begins. Bishop f5. Well, a nice active move from Van Foreest. Bishop comes outside the pawn chain, and nice diagonal looks at the important e4 square. So just development, and now e3. Again, a kind of gentle move, but it's not a bad move, of course. The queen wants to play to e2, and then the rooks will be connected. But it's hard to imagine that black has any difficulties in this position. Knight e4 hits the outpost. And, you know, potentially this bishop could come into play on the long diagonal. Knight c3. Knights are exchanged, and the bishop takes the place of the knight on the e4 outpost. But, you know, it's a little bit more comfortable for white because of there's just a little bit more control in the centre. But, of course, black is absolutely rock solid. a5 gains little ground on the queen side. And now, well, how does white play this position? I think if the knight comes back and the bishops are exchanged, then black doesn't have any difficulties. So bishop f1 is a good try, typical of these kind of positions. So the bishop ducks back and threatens to play knight d2 to get at that bishop. So Van Foreest makes, I think, a good decision here. Before the bishop is hit, he decides to exchange off, and actually has a neat little plan here. He plays knight c5, so that exploits the pin. I think if that's taken, then, well, that looks very comfortable for black after that exchange. So basically the knight wants to come in here. It's not going to remain on c5 for very long. So Carlsen preempts the knight coming into e4. And yeah, the knight hits the outpost. So bishop d3 hits the knight, and f5 from Van Foreest. So he's playing actively. I mean, the knight could drop back in, but it's a bit passive. f5 just, you know, stands ground, basically. Good move. And g5, nice and active. So now things start to hot up. The queen comes back to e2. Now, if black plays a move like, let's say, queen f6, then the knight gets hit back. And white is the one with play in this position. Basically, you've got to time it correctly, but there are two pawn breaks here. One is e4, and one is maybe c5 and then b4, or indeed b4 straight away. and black hasn't got much play there. But Van Foreest had anticipated this position and played g4. Good move, very good move. So the knight is looking to spin round via g5 and into the f3 square. And if the knight reaches g5, then white's king is under some pressure there. So Carlsen exchanged off. Now, if d takes e4, then white will be able to break in the middle. So a temporary pawn sacrifice, queen b5. This is a lot of fun for white. You can see basically the rooks and the queen are more active than black's major pieces. That's very pleasant for white. But that was never Van Foreest's intention. He gave up a pawn. So this is far more enterprising. So queen takes g4, Magnus takes the pawn. But the point is this, that white can't advance in the centre. Black just blocks out white with this lovely pawn chain. And in fact, you know, this extra pawn for white on the king side really means nothing at all. In fact, you could even argue it sort of opens up lines for black here. But first things first, got to defend that pawn. So queen e8. Carlsen exchanges. Of course, Van Foreest recaptures with the e pawn. So that means, you know, this rook is shut out. And yeah, pawn to h5 is the move you want to make. Push the queen back, you know, get your your major pieces in rather, and black has an attack, a very strong attack actually. So Carlsen has to play actively. He played rook c5, attacking the pawn here. h5 hits the queen back, and that h-pawn could be very useful for black. And here Van Foreest plays queen f7. b5 was a very interesting option, basically shutting that rook out. Now it does leave that pawn backward, but if black is going to play rook f6 anyway, then it's well supported, and yeah, then the queen and the rook could swing over to the king side. So that's an interesting way of playing. But instead queen f7. Now at the moment that pawn can't be taken because there'll be trouble down here. So queen g2 defends that, and now this pawn advances out of danger. And that exchange will certainly help black. That a pawn looks a bit weak. So Carlsen closed the position, but it also means that he's able to use that lever with b5. Queen d7. So Van Foreest brings the queen over, and he's looking to advance that pawn. b5, Carlsen creates counterplay. h4, so both sides, you know, getting in their respective plans. Really interesting. Rook dc1, and well, Van Foreest doesn't play this straight away. I mean, that was an option to play h3 here. Instead, he defends this pawn, an exchange, and g4. Now, if Carlsen can play h3, then that really does start to block out black's pieces on the king side. Gives white some security. The pawn would support the pawn on g4. Yeah, the rook could come down here, but got to watch that pawn there. So yeah, h3, that's what white threatens. Now Van Foreest recognised that, and he gave up a second pawn. Really interesting play, very dynamic. Carlsen took it. Rook a f8. So just for a moment, it's not possible to sort of get security here. You know, after this pawn sacrifice, the queen came back. Now, the interesting idea is just to put that rook on h6, looking to bring the rook on f2, f3, and so you can see that that pawn will be attacked. But instead, Van Foreest plays rook g6, and then rook f5. Again, he could play rook f3 here, with the idea of swinging that rook round to h3. But I mean, this position is very hard to calculate. my computer indicates this line. Watch this. And you can see that, you know, white still doesn't have complete security because that pawn is slightly out on a limb. Rook g4, of course, threatened. f3 hits the rook. This looks a bit scary, but queen takes. And basically, black should be all right here. That's a very computery line. You know, those moves certainly not easy to determine. So that was rook f3. Instead, Van Foreest plays rook f5. Attacking here, so h4. And now bishop f8 hits the rook, which dropped back, and now bishop e7. So, well, the point of this, of course, is that black is looking to exchange or sacrifice on g5 and break through to the king. You might take with the bishop, you might take with the rook. So it's getting very tricky. And here, again, very hard to calculate this position. The players weren't in sort of raging time pressure, but they were sort of down to something like a minute a move. And that's very hard to calculate precisely. Carlsen should have played king f1. And after bishop takes pawn, rook b1, certainly not an easy move, is the best move, and apparently that's winning for white. You can see for the moment that bishop is pinned, and white threatens to get counterplay down the b file. Not, but very difficult to calculate that. Let's go back. But instead, Carlsen played rook b2 straight away. And here, the best way for black to play is rook f takes g5. So, getting rid of the h and g pawns and winning the queen. I say winning the queen. White has two rooks for the queen. I mean, this one is hard to judge. You know, the rook could potentially shift over here to check down there. I mean, apparently black has enough counterplay, but, you know, this is not easy to determine. Should be a draw. Instead, Van Foreest played bishop takes g5, which certainly looks very tempting indeed. The king slipped away, and now the queen attacks from the other side. This is really scary. And Carlsen now played queen g4, but he missed a winning move here. A move that, well, I think if you spot it, then you'd appreciate that this is a winning move. But Carlsen did not spot it. If he'd considered king e2, I think would have appreciated fairly quickly that this is winning. I mean, it certainly looks odd to sort of walk into checks. So queen a6 check. And the king is actually pretty safe here. If check, then the rook blocks. At the other end of the board, white just wants to take the bishop. Now, there's a pin here, so if king g7, you can take, and queen h2. And you can see the bishop basically blocks out the rooks. The rook will block out the queen, and then the king staggers over, and it should be winning for white. Now that's very tricky, but king e2 is the move. I mean, black has various other tries as well, but white is winning that position. Not an obvious move. Instead, Carlsen played queen g4, which also doesn't look bad. Hitting the rook, maintaining the pin here. And this is probably what Carlsen missed, because after the check, it's quite possible that he was considering rook e2, which at first glance looks very strong. It seems to shut out the queen. But watch this, queen c8, brilliant move. Defending the rook, but also threatening rook takes pawn check, winning the queen. That's the trick. And if the queen goes back, say king here, that defends the rook. So now pawn takes, and in this case, That's the end of the road for the king. That rook actually just blocks the escape square. So that must have been the move that Carlsen missed, queen c8. But when he got to this position after the check, his sense of danger did not desert him, and instead of rook e2, he played the king back to g1. So that steps out of trouble. Of course, it makes no sense for the queen to come back because there's no discovered check there now. So now rook g7. So white doesn't want to take here because you lose the queen. And if queen f5, check. And queen f1, there's a rather unwelcome visitor for white. Checkmate. So very careful calculation needed in this position. Carlsen checked. Now if the king steps up, then queen takes rook is check. And the tables turn again. White would win. So Van Foreest played bishop d8. That can be taken with check, but now rook f8. Rooks exchanged, and here is the point that at the end of this, the king is protecting the rook and white loses the queen. So is that the end of the road for white? No, because Carlsen, after giving up the queen, has rook and bishop, and here's an important move, a3. That means that everything is now protected and black cannot make progress in this position. So yes, it's a blockade. Carlsen famously said at some point he doesn't believe in blockades. Well, he had to believe in one here, and he was right to do so because black can make absolutely no progress, and the game ended in a draw by perpetual check. Let me just show you one possible idea. If the queen comes down, maybe hoping for a Zugzwang position, then rook h3. And, well, if the king comes here, then h5, and now black has to be very, very careful. So basically in this position, black just has to sit there, and it's going to be a draw. Well, a really entertaining game, lots of cut and thrust, and I have to say I was very impressed by Jorden van Foreest's enterprise in this game. I really like this idea of g5 followed by g4. He realised that if he didn't want to lose the initiative, then he had to keep playing actively, even at the cost of the pawn. And he recognised that he actually had, well, let's just say sufficient play to hold the balance, which he did very well on the whole. I mean, even at the highest level, players don't play a perfect game, and both of them missed chances. But I think a draw was an absolutely fair result. So that means, let's look at the standings. Out in the lead still with 3 out of 4, Vidit Gujarati with 3 out of 4, and then there's a stack of players on 2.5. Yes, Penko, Carlsen, Mamedyarov, Rapport and Van Foreest. Pragyanananda, last time I looked, was about to win his first game. He did win. It actually finished while I was recording. So Pragyanananda bounces up to 2 out of 4. That's excellent. I'm delighted to hear that. So rest day tomorrow, rest day on Wednesday, which is great for me. If you want some alternative entertainment, then Brentford are playing against Manchester United. I'm looking forward to that. See you for round 5 in a couple of days.